Because weddings are a great place to meet women, and when I dance, I look like this.
In 2018, doctors reportedly told Matthew Perry's family there was only a 2% chance he would survive. His colon had burst after years of opioid abuse. His lungs were failing. His body was shutting down so badly that he had to be connected to an ECMO machine just to stay alive. For a moment, one of the most recognizable faces in the world was lying in a hospital bed with almost no chance of making it through the night. And the strange part is, most people had no idea any of this was happening. Because while Matthew Perry was fighting to stay alive behind closed hospital doors, millions of people still saw him as Chandler Bing, the sarcastic guy from Friends, the funny one, the man who made awkwardness lovable. Audience laughter, bright studio lights, one-liners, smiles. That was the version of Matthew Perry the world chose to remember. But behind that image was a man whose body had already been collapsing for years. Matthew later revealed that he spent nearly $9 million trying to get sober. Rehab centers, detox programs, emergency medical treatment, private doctors, therapy, surgery, over and over again. Not to become happier, not to rebuild his career, just to survive.
And what makes this story disturbing isn't simply the addiction itself. It's that the world may have been watching him slowly destroy himself in plain sight without fully realizing it. Years later, fans would go back and re-watch Friends differently. The sweating, the dramatic weight changes between seasons, the exhausted interviews, the hollow look behind the jokes. Suddenly, it didn't just feel like a sitcom anymore. It felt like watching someone trying to hold himself together long enough to finish the next episode. Because the terrifying truth about Matthew Perry is this: by the time the public realized how serious his condition really was, he had already been disappearing for a very long time.
By the mid-1990s, Matthew Perry had become one of the most recognizable faces on television. Friends exploded into a global phenomenon almost overnight, and at the center of it was Chandler Bing. Sarcastic, insecure, awkward, and painfully funny. He wasn't the cool guy in the group. He was the guy who used humor to survive uncomfortable situations, and that's exactly why millions of people connected with him. Chandler made insecure people feel understood. He made loneliness look funny instead of embarrassing. To audiences around the world, Matthew Perry seemed naturally effortless, quick, charming, relaxed, like someone born to make people laugh. But behind the scenes, the reality was already becoming much darker. Long before the hospitalizations and rehab headlines, Matthew Perry was reportedly dealing with deep insecurity, anxiety, and an emotional emptiness that success never fully fixed. And the terrifying part was that fame didn't calm those feelings down. It amplified them. The more people loved Chandler Bing, the more pressure there was to keep being Chandler Bing all the time. In interviews, on set, in public appearances, even in private conversations, people expected Matthew Perry to always be the funniest person in the room. And slowly, the line between the character and the real man behind him started to disappear. Because the world didn't really want Matthew Perry. They wanted Chandler Bing forever. And while Friends was becoming the biggest sitcom in America, Matthew Perry was quietly becoming chemically dependent just to feel normal enough to keep smiling. According to Matthew Perry himself, the first time he took Vicodin after a jet ski accident, something inside him changed almost immediately. But what made his story so disturbing was that he didn't describe the pills like some exciting Hollywood party drug. He described them like relief, like noise suddenly disappearing inside his head. For years, Matthew had reportedly struggled with anxiety, insecurity, loneliness, and a constant need for approval. Even before Friends made him world famous, there were already cracks beneath the surface. He had grown up between divorced parents, constantly moving between Canada and Los Angeles, never fully feeling stable anywhere. Humor became survival. If he could make people laugh, they stayed. If he stopped being funny, he feared they would leave. And then fame arrived at the worst possible moment. Friends exploded into one of the biggest television shows in history. At the exact same time, Matthew Perry's dependency on painkillers began growing stronger. Suddenly, there was unlimited money, unlimited access, and almost unlimited pressure.
The show was making hundreds of millions of dollars. The cast became global celebrities. Chandler Bing became iconic. And the bigger the machine became, the harder it became for anyone to slow it down. Because as long as the ratings stayed high and audiences kept laughing, the system around him kept moving forward. But viewers slowly began noticing something strange. Between seasons, Matthew Perry's appearance changed dramatically. Sometimes he looked thin and exhausted. Other times, his face appeared swollen and heavier. Interviews became more uncomfortable to watch. His energy shifted constantly. Fans didn't fully understand what they were looking at back then, but years later, many would re-watch Friends with completely different eyes. Suddenly, the sitcom started feeling unsettling. It no longer looked like a carefree comedy about 6 friends in New York. At times, it looked like a man chemically trying to hold himself together under studio lights. Matthew later admitted that during certain seasons, he was heavily drinking. During others, he was using opioids. And during some periods, he was sober. The audience had unknowingly been watching different versions of the same man slowly losing control in real time. And then Matthew Perry revealed something even darker. There were entire years of Friends he barely remembered filming at all.
When Matthew Perry admitted that there were entire seasons of Friends he barely remembered filming, it completely changed the way many fans viewed the show forever. Imagine becoming one of the most famous actors on Earth, starring in the biggest sitcom of your generation, making millions of people laugh every week, and barely remembering large parts of it happening. While audiences were building emotional memories around Chandler Bing, Matthew Perry was reportedly losing pieces of his own memory in real time. By this point, the addiction was no longer recreational. It was survival. The cycle had become brutal. Detox, rehab, relapse, repeat, over and over again. Matthew entered treatment multiple times throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, trying desperately to regain control while still carrying the pressure of a global television empire on his shoulders. And what made the situation even more dangerous was the amount of money surrounding him. Most addicts eventually run out of resources.
Matthew Perry reportedly had enough money to continue destroying himself for years while still functioning publicly. Fame insulated the collapse. Private doctors, expensive treatment centers, handlers, production schedules, PR protection. The machine around Friends was simply too massive to stop easily. As long as Chandler Bing kept making audiences laugh, everything kept moving forward. But underneath the jokes, Matthew's body was already beginning to break down. His weight fluctuated violently between seasons. His speech sometimes slowed. His eyes often looked exhausted, even while delivering punchlines. And according to some reports, people close to the production were becoming increasingly concerned about how severe his dependency had become. Yet somehow, the show continued filming. The applause continued. The laughter continued. And perhaps that's what makes this story feel so unsettling now. Millions of people were watching one of the most beloved sitcoms in television history, while behind the scenes, one of its biggest stars was quietly collapsing physically and psychologically. Addiction had stopped being pleasurable a long time ago. By then, it was maintenance, a daily battle just to feel stable enough to get through another scene, another interview, another episode. And after years of chemical abuse, the damage inside his body was becoming impossible to hide. Because eventually, the drugs stopped only affecting his mind. They started destroying his body too.
Over the years, Matthew Perry reportedly spent nearly $9 million trying to stay sober, and somehow, even that wasn't enough. At first, that number sounds almost impossible to understand. $9 million. But when you look closer, the number becomes less shocking than the reason behind it.
That money reportedly went toward rehab facilities, detox programs, emergency medical treatment, therapy, sober living homes, private nurses, surgeries, and recovery specialists. It wasn't luxury anymore. It was survival. Every relapse created another cycle of damage, another attempt to rebuild his body, another attempt to regain control over his mind. And the terrifying part was that addiction had stopped looking dramatic from the outside. There were no wild Hollywood party stories anymore, no glamorous celebrity chaos. By this stage, it had become repetitive, exhausting, and deeply lonely. Matthew Perry later spoke openly about the shame that came with addiction, the embarrassment, the self-hatred, the feeling of becoming someone he increasingly didn't recognize anymore. Addiction had stopped making him feel good a long time ago. At this point, it was simply preventing him from collapsing completely.
And underneath all of it was a deeper psychological problem that money couldn't fix. Because Matthew Perry wasn't only trapped by drugs, he was trapped by Chandler Bing. The character had become so successful that it slowly began swallowing his identity. Millions of people loved Chandler. They quoted Chandler. They wanted Matthew Perry to always be funny, always charming, always entertaining. But privately, according to several interviews and his own memoir, he often felt empty, emotionally disconnected, and terrified of being alone with himself. The more the world loved Chandler Bing, the more invisible Matthew Perry reportedly felt inside his own life. Even his relationships reflected the same pattern. He often spoke about pushing people away, sabotaging intimacy, and fearing abandonment before it even happened. Fame surrounded him with attention, but not necessarily connection. And that may be one of the darkest parts of this story. Matthew Perry became one of the most recognized men in America, while privately becoming one of the loneliest. By the late 2000s, the damage was no longer emotional alone. Years of substance abuse had reportedly begun destroying his digestive system, weakening his body, and causing severe medical complications. Hospital visits became more frequent, recovery became harder, and despite the money, the fame, the treatment, and all the second chances, his body was reaching a breaking point. Then in 2018, after years of surviving addiction, Matthew Perry's body finally gave up.
In 2018, Matthew Perry's colon burst from years of opioid abuse. The damage inside his body had become so severe that he was rushed into emergency surgery. And according to reports, doctors later told his family he had only a 2% chance of surviving. Suddenly, this was no longer a story about celebrity addiction. This was a man dying. His lungs began failing. He was placed into a coma and connected to an ECMO machine, a device used when the body can no longer provide enough oxygen on its own. He spent months in the hospital. Multiple surgeries followed. At one point, he reportedly had to use a colostomy bag for an extended period during recovery. The same man millions of people remembered as the quick-witted, sarcastic Chandler Bing was now learning how to survive inside a severely damaged body. And what makes this part of the story so horrifying is how physically brutal it really was. Addiction had finally moved beyond emotional suffering and started destroying him from the inside out.
The body that once stood under bright sitcom lights every week was now covered in scars, tubes, and medical equipment. Recovery itself became its own nightmare. Matthew later described unbearable pain, fear, isolation, and moments where survival no longer felt guaranteed. And strangely, even after nearly dying, many people still didn't fully understand how serious his condition truly was. To the public, he was still mostly the funny guy from Friends. That image had become so powerful that it almost erased the reality of the man underneath it. The audience remembered punchlines. The industry remembered ratings. But behind that famous smile was someone whose body had spent years slowly collapsing under addiction. And maybe the darkest part is that surviving this didn't magically save him emotionally. Because after the surgeries, after the hospital, after the miracle of staying alive,
The internal battle reportedly still continued. The loneliness was still there. The anxiety was still there. The need to escape himself was still there. Matthew Perry had survived something that should have killed him. But survival and peace are not the same thing. And by the final years of his life, it became painfully clear that the real thing haunting him may never have been the drugs alone.
By the final years of his life, Matthew Perry seemed terrifyingly aware of what was happening to him. That's part of what made his story so disturbing. He wasn't someone blindly destroying himself without understanding the consequences. In interviews, public appearances, and especially in his memoir, Matthew often spoke with brutal honesty about addiction, shame, fear, and loneliness. Sometimes the honesty was so raw, it made people uncomfortable. There were moments where it sounded less like a celebrity telling stories and more like a man documenting a private war he was exhausted from fighting. And the deeper you look at Matthew Perry's life, the harder it becomes to believe the drugs were ever the real root of the problem. They were the symptom, the escape, the temporary silence. Because underneath the addiction was something darker and far more difficult to treat, an overwhelming fear of emptiness. Fame gave Matthew Perry money, attention, and recognition on a level most people can't even imagine. But it never seemed to give him peace. If anything, success intensified the problem. The world loved Chandler Bing so completely that Matthew Perry reportedly struggled to separate his own identity from the character. He became trapped inside a version of himself that the public expected him to perform forever. Funny, charming, quick with a joke, always entertaining. But eventually, maintaining that image appeared emotionally exhausting. According to several interviews, he often feared being abandoned, feared not being enough, and feared what happened when the laughter stopped. And that's what makes the entire story feel so tragic. Matthew Perry spent decades trying to escape pain while living inside one of the most successful careers in Hollywood. From the outside, his life looked untouchable. Wealth, fame, admiration, iconic status. But internally, he seemed stuck in a cycle where nothing was ever enough to quiet whatever he was running from. Not relationships, not success, not rehab, not even surviving near death. His memoir shocked many readers because of how self-aware he sounded. Matthew Perry understood addiction deeply. He understood how it manipulated him, damaged him, isolated him, and nearly killed him. And somehow, even with all that awareness, he still struggled to fully outrun it. Maybe that's why his story continues to hit people so hard, because it forces an uncomfortable realization. A person can be loved by millions and still feel completely alone. A person can have unlimited resources and still feel emotionally trapped. And maybe Matthew Perry didn't spend $9 million trying to survive drugs alone. Maybe he spent it trying to survive himself. For decades, millions of people turned on their televisions and saw Chandler Bing smiling back at them. The jokes felt effortless. The timing felt perfect. The laughter sounded endless. To an entire generation, Matthew Perry became part of their comfort, part of their routine, part of some of their happiest memories. But behind that image was a man fighting battles most people never truly saw. A man who reportedly spent years trapped between addiction, shame, loneliness, and the terrifying pressure of constantly needing to be on. And maybe that's what makes his story so haunting. Not simply that he struggled, not simply that he nearly died, but that so much of it happened while the whole world was still laughing. Looking back now, many scenes from Friends feel different. The smiles, the exhaustion behind his eyes, the dramatic physical changes between seasons, the interviews where he looked distant. What once looked like harmless sitcom nostalgia now carries a much darker feeling underneath it. Because the audience was unknowingly watching someone slowly disappear in real time. Matthew Perry spent years making millions of strangers feel less alone, while privately becoming one of the loneliest men in Hollywood. He survived rehab. He survived relapse.
He survived surgeries, addiction, and even a 2% chance of living. But some wounds are deeper than the body. Some battles continue long after survival itself. And maybe the most disturbing part of Matthew Perry's story is this. For years, the world watched Chandler Bing make people laugh, without realizing that behind the jokes was a man spending millions of dollars just trying to survive long enough to keep smiling. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more stories about the hidden realities behind Hollywood fame, make sure to subscribe and watch our next video.